What's going on, YouTube? And welcome to Gold Line Hockey. It's Kevin Forte, and today we are taking a look at the Washington Capitals down in DC. A disappointing season for the Caps. They missed the playoffs, and there's kind of the expectation that we could see some pretty significant changes in the Capitals organization throughout the lineup. We've already seen here that they fired Peter Laviolette. Make sure to check out that video. I already posted that one. But today we're taking a look more so at the actual roster. Who could be moved out? Now I'm going to start off. There's three different categories I have. There's trade, keep, and future. And I think part of the reason you're okay with trading some guys now is because you know what's in the future or in the very distant, the distant current times. So when I look at who should be traded, it's kind of difficult. I think a lot of it comes down to the first one being TJ Oshie, and I've talked about this in live streams before. You guys all said he's not going to get traded. But what I think is interesting with Oshie is what's his mindset right now? Is he even going to retire? I've heard potential rumblings he could retire this summer, and if that ends up coming to fruition, how does that change the Capitals forward group with him out of the lineup, right? So that's something to watch for. So I put him as a trade, but I don't know if that might even be available if he ends up retiring. Evgeny Kuznetsov, I think this is kind of a guarantee. He's kind of been dragging his feet really the last 6 months. Kuznetsov just hasn't been the player he was back in 2018 when they won that Stanley Cup. He's just not that form, and he really hasn't been for a while now. It's going to be difficult for the Caps to trade him, though, because it doesn't seem like his value is that high. So what kind of value do you get for him? Plus his big contract. It'll be interesting to see what the Capitals can muster up there. Anthony Mantha, I think, is an interesting one. I think Mantha's name has been thrown out there a little bit. I could see him getting, flipped for somebody. The one we've talked about before is maybe Mantha for Josh Bailey. I don't think it's going to happen just because of Mantha's health compared to Josh Bailey's potential. But that's kind of what you're looking at, right? Like the James Neal for Milan Lucic, right? Can you find a team that's got a guy that's making too much money, 1 year left on his deal, that just needs a change of scenery? I think that's what the Mantha situation will come down to this summer. Maybe they trade him for a defenseman of a similar value and a similar situation. So I think just to change your scenery is really key here for Anthony Mantha. I think he will get traded or potentially even bought out this summer. So I do not expect to see him back in Washington next season. In terms of keep, I think the list is pretty short, honestly. But I think it's kind of delves more into the future. Ovechkin, he's not moving anywhere. I think that's an easy one. They're trying to get him to the league's most goals of any guy in his career. So until that happens, Ovi is staying in Washington. I think he's going to be a forever Capital, and I think that's kind of what we're looking at with Ovechkin. I don't think anything is going to happen there. Kind of boring, but that's the status. I've heard John Carlson's name potentially in trade rumors. I just don't see it. I think, again, similar to Mantha, his health is a big thing. So even if the Capitals were to trade a guy like Mantha, he really hasn't been healthy enough. And teams will say, listen, great player, probably should have been in the Norris conversation this year. But he didn't play enough games, and he wasn't consistently in the lineup. He was injured a lot. I'm not going to take my bets on him, and then that lowers his value. So now the Caps are trading him for value that, he's probably worth more than what the market would be willing to give right now. So I think John Carlson and Ovechkin are pretty locked in. Same thing for Dylan Strome. I think Dylan Strome just got that extension. Really good player. He might even be their first-line center here throughout the next couple of years, depending on what they do at the draft. If depending on what happens with some of these other prospects, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think Dylan Strome is definitely a focal point in the top 6 of the Capitals. And I'm really excited to see what he can do, because I think what we saw this year is a glimpse of what he's capable of and what he's shown in the OHL when he was playing with the Erie Otters. With Connor McDavid, is a really good hockey player, and I think that he's finally finding that form down in Washington. Now, the other one here is, again, it depends on what you think of Sonny Milano, but I think the fact he just got that little extension, a 2 or 3 year extension, I don't think they'll be trading him this summer. I think Milano's been a good fit for the Caps, similar to the way Strome has been a good fit, right? He was kind of just a pickup. He started the season in the AHL with the Hershey Bears. So he didn't even start this season in the NHL. He found his way into the Caps lineup. He was playing really well in Hershey, came up to Washington, kind of continued that, and got a deal done before the deadline to keep him in Washington. So I like both of those guys. Really good pickups by the staff there in Washington, because I think those are guys that nobody was really looking at in the summer saying, wait, that's what the Capitals added this summer? They turned out to be really important assets of this team, and signed prove-it deals last summer, and now they get their big paychecks for the next couple of years to stay down in the nation's capital. So really good job there by the staff in Washington. So this kind of delves into the future of the Capitals, because the future looks very bright for Washington. They have some really good prospects here that I'm really excited for. The one that I'm least excited for, but I think is worth mentioning, is Alexei Protas. I think I saw him against the Islanders a couple of weeks ago during the end of the season. He is a big dude. Alexei Protas is a big man, and I think he could be, depending on what happens with Tom Wilson over the next year or two, I think that's going to be and we'll get to that. We'll get there with Tom Wilson. I think Alexei Protas will be that type of player on the Capitals in the future. I really like what he's already kind of shown in glimpses. He's not the best skater, but I think that's something that once he adapts to the NHL game, he'll be able to keep a spot steady in the NHL lineup just because of his toughness and, kind of bringing that little bit of snarl to the lineup. I really like that about Protas. He's not your typical player that the Capitals are looking for the future, but he's definitely a player that is needed in the lineup. And especially if you trade guys like Mantha, you need those types of guys around. Connor McMichael. I really like McMichael. We remember him in his days in the WHL. Really good hockey player. Really interested to see what he does, because he's already been playing pro the last 2 years now with the Hershey Bears. So I'm really excited to see what he is capable of. I think that was kind of part of the Peter Laviolette effect, was we weren't going to see much of a guy like Connor McMichael, so I think it's a really good thing for him. He'll be in the lineup more next year, and I think the Capitals are ready, more than ready, to see him down in D.C. Alexander Alexiev. I really like Alexiev as a defenseman. I think the Capitals are still a little bit on the fringe of whether he's a top 4 defenseman or not. But I think there's some potential there. Similar to McMichael, he'll probably get more ice time next year, which I think is a good thing for the Caps. And I think it's going to be good for his development. So, it's a make-or-break year coming up for Alexiev. Maybe we talk about him getting traded next summer, but I just don't think at this point it's not worth it probably for the Capitals to move on from Alexander Alexiev. Hendrix Lapierre, similar to Connor McMichael, those are 1, 2 potentially top 6 centers of the future for the Capitals, or maybe one of them moves to the wing. I really like both of these guys. Hendrix Lapierre, again, he's a good hockey player. This is a guy that the Capitals drafted fairly early in the first 3 rounds of the draft, and he's a highly thought of prospect for the Caps. So I think this is a guy that if I'm a Capitals fan, definitely excited for. Got a lot of scoring potential. He could score. I look at McMichael more as the playmaker, and Hendrix Lapierre is definitely more of a scorer. He can score some goals. He's got a great shot, great release. I think the Capitals have a good future with a guy like Hendrix Lapierre, and including a guy like Connor McMichael. So now we look at Ivan Miroznachenko. This was a late draft pick of the Capitals in the first round, and the big question around Miroznachenko, will he go to North America? He has a deal right now in the KHL. We know how these things go. We've seen it in the past. But I think Miroznachenko was a great pickup by the Caps with where they drafted him. And I think he's going to end up coming down to Washington. He might be one of the steals in that draft as soon as potentially next year or 2 years. He still has a little bit of development to do, and that was part of the reason he was drafted later in the first round, but a really good player. I think the Capitals expect a lot from him in the future, and definitely being a core piece of this team. So when I look at some of those assets, looking at guys like Kuznetsov and Mantha being available, definitely makes sense. Hagelin is now going to be off the books, which I hate to say it is kind of a win for the Capitals because his health has really been a problem. Goalie-wise, you're not going to see any changes there. Kemper and Lindgren both signed deals last summer, so I don't expect anything there. And then that kind of comes to the question, well, what happens with guys like Connor Sheary? What happens with guys like Tom Wilson? So Connor Sheary, I don't know how much value is out there. If you can find a way to get a first or a second round pick for Connor Sheary, you take that deal. If not, you're better off just probably keeping him because you need wingers on this team. But with that said, if the deal is right, if you could find a team willing to take it on and make it work, definitely trade Connor Sheary. And I know fans like him there in Washington, but for the right price, the price is right, you might have to move him out. And I kind of say the same thing for Tom Wilson. I think Wilson's value is definitely there. You know, as a Capitals team, he's kind of a big part of their identity. So moving a guy like Wilson would definitely be moving a mountain, literally and figuratively, because he is such a big part of the identity of the Capitals, right? And, you know, the fact they already traded Garnet Hathaway, and now you may be moving on from Mantha, Kuznetsov. Those are guys that are a pain in the ass to play against. So now you kind of keep trading out a bunch of those guys. Can you afford to trade out Tom Wilson now? So, you know, that kind of edge to the Capitals game really goes away if Wilson's not there. So I definitely think it'll be interesting. He was injured this past season, so maybe his value isn't where it maybe should be in terms of what he really is. He's a very valuable player. And I think teams would be willing to give up a lot for a guy like Tom Wilson. But again, another year away from free agency. Do the Capitals try to cash in as much value for him now instead of trading him at the deadline in a lost season that maybe if, you know, barring maybe even more injuries next season, you know, Tom Wilson doesn't look like that great of an asset next summer. So maybe it's better that they find a way to get him dealt this summer. Try and get as much value for him as you can. A first, a second round pick, first and second round pick, hopefully. Because I think teams would be willing to do that. He is that kind of guy. He's a pain in the ass. He can score goals. He scores clutch goals at points for the Capitals. And I think they, you know, if you can sell teams on the fact that, hey, he had a bad season. Our whole team wasn't very good this year. He had some bad luck with injuries, but he'll be ready to go next year. He's a capable top six guy that can hit, fight, do everything you need him to do. I think teams would be sold. If you could get teams to bite and sell on that, I think it could be a really good fit for the Capitals in terms of value coming back. So that's kind of how I see the Capitals. I think there's a lot of things that are going to change down there in D.C. You know, fortunately enough, earlier this year, I did go to their not their most recent game, but the game against the Islanders where they lost in a shootout. I was down there in Washington, and shout out to the Caps fans. You guys are awesome down there. I love the Caps fans. They were really nice to me. Really, really cool people. So shout out to the Caps fans out there because you guys it was very, very nice down there. I really enjoyed my time there. Meeting a couple of you guys down at a couple of bars and stuff like that. It was pretty cool. So I definitely appreciate that. So that's it for today's video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like the video and subscribe if you have not already. And I will see you again next time.